Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really fascinating guest involved in science, technology, innovation, creating a better tomorrow. Today on the show, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Manfred Stapff. He is a physician as well as a pharmaceutical industry leader, has over 3 decades of experience in areas of internal medicine and clinical research and drug development, and has worked across a very diverse range of therapeutic areas, including cardiovascular, central nervous system, respiratory oncology, as well as NASH, GI, anti-infective, and orphan diseases. Dr. Stapff has held senior leadership roles at Merck, at Forest Laboratories, at LG Chem, and specialized in clinical development, regulatory affairs, as well as global medical operations in those roles, and served as the chief medical officer of a company called TriNetX, which he helped build at the time the world's largest real-world data research network, and we'll be getting a lot into that on the show. Extensive expertise, as mentioned, across clinical trials, drug development, regulatory affairs, quality management, and real-world studies. As the co-founder of the Candidate Advisory, he helps organizations leverage real-world data as well as applications of artificial intelligence to ultimately improve healthcare decision-making, regulatory strategies. And he has a new book out entitled Real-World Evidence Unveiled, Navigating the Maze of Modern Misinformation, which ultimately explores how misinformation data ultimately shapes science, media, public health, and hopefully how we can separate fact from fiction. It's a really good read. A lot to get into today. I'm looking forward to this episode. Dr. Manfred Stapff, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for summarizing 30 years of career into a little bit more than 1 minute. That's awful. I think I should ask you to write my CV because you really did very, very well. I had to put on my glasses to look a little bit more intellectual. So thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's good. It's great having you. And I didn't get into everything in the introduction. And you know, I would love to start out. I mean, I took, you know, a look sort of way back. And one of the things that popped out to me, Manfred, right away, you know, aside from obviously the fact that you went to medical school and you know, became a physician, was that I guess the very first thing you were involved in before all these themes that we're going to be getting into today, you were a flight surgeon back in the 80s, taking care of pilots and airport personnel and search and rescue missions. Take us back to the early days, if you would. I'd love to hear sort of the background to the background, how all this got started off with you.
Yeah, this was really the starting of my career as a physician. As a background knowledge, in the 80s, Germany had the draft system, so not a voluntary system in the military. Everyone who was sort of healthy and intelligent enough got drafted, and I got drafted as a physician. So this was my first position as a physician. And interestingly, it was in the German Air Force in the Institute of Air and Space Medicine. So it really had to do with being the family practitioner for the pilots, but also with some research, ergonomy of the cockpits, for example, what kind of instruments are easier to read to the human eye, how to design a cockpit. At that time, one realized, for example, that pilots become taller and taller, as the normal population also did. So it was a very, very interesting time also with search and rescue, helicopter flights to crashed airplanes. Unfortunately, I never had to deal with serious injuries or death pilots. It was a very, very great time. I always mention that because despite it's many, many decades ago, it's actually in the last millennium. But what you do first in your professional career, some kind helps you and also shapes you for the rest of your career. And for me, it was really to being challenged without having the full clinical training and residency. I was already challenged by cases which normally require a longer experience as a physician. And then obviously the hierarchy in the military, it's something you have to be adjusted, the procedures in the military, the bureaucracy in the military. So it was a very challenging but also forming time. And I definitely enjoyed it. Would have extended it, but at that time the drafting system was limited to about 1.5 years. But it formed me, it created my mentality for future work in the medical field, more intensive than one would think when it's just 1.5 years.
Mm, mm. Well, in addition to that shaping, you're practicing clinical medicine at the time, immunology, HIV care, angiology, and at the same time, I apologize, I didn't mention this in the intro, but you also find time to do a PhD in the area of diagnostic ultrasound technologies and publish extensively in those years, everything from deep leg thrombosis to investigating all these interesting artifacts when I guess ultrasound isn't done properly. Say a couple words about this, because as we get into real world evidence and diagnostics and sort of this era of the companion diagnostic, I think that area gets overlooked. And I want you just to talk a little bit about your early days in this as well, because the hand in hand with drug development and with some of where our discussion is going to be going, I think is kind of important. So say a couple words about that particular part of the early career.
Yeah, this was my time as a physician after the military service in the university clinic in Munich. It was a polyclinic, which the word polyclinic comes actually from the Greek word for village or for city. So not for multiple, but for polis, meaning the city. And it was in the center of the city, which means it was more or less the emergency room for the city of Munich in the main railway station area. And you can imagine in this environment, you see a lot of various cases. From simple hypertension to arteriosclerosis to HIV at that time was up and coming, was a very wide learning about internal medicine. And in Germany, diagnostic ultrasound is a task of the doctors. In the United States, you have technicians doing that and then reporting to the physicians about the result of the ultrasound, whether it's abdominal ultrasound or cardiac ultrasound. It's performed by technicians. The thinking in Germany is if the physician does this themselves, they have the opportunity to adjust, since it's a live examination, to adjust their way, where to look, what to look at, how to talk with the patient to what they are see. You see something a little bit, let's say just on the liver, you basically as a physician immediately draw your attention to other areas in the liver. You spend more time there rather than just going through an examination protocol. So we did that also during our internal medicine time. And if you are in a university clinic, obviously you do some studies, you do some publications, you give some seminars, and that's how my interest in diagnostic ultrasound developed. And you have enough cases to support your scientific work. Uh, and can publish accordingly. We will discuss later in the real world evidence area how important a high sample size can be and how helpful it can be that you have enough cases to draw conclusions. And we developed a method to replace the radiographic iodide-based diagnosis of deep vein thrombosis by ultrasound, which does not have any radiation, doesn't have any iodide risk, and is very safe and is very clear and was a safe diagnostic method. And we did some other stuff. The abdominal ultrasound, as many people know, is a very safe and a very helpful diagnostic method in many areas. I would say all mothers know it also that you can do an ultrasound and it does not create damage.
Right.
At that time, I mentioned HIV. It was in the late 80s, early 90s. We also realized that the potential alternatives of treatments in HIV were very limited. Not only against the virus, but also against the complications. And this was one of many reasons why I got more and more drawn into research and were thinking to myself, we have to do more. We have to develop more drugs. We have to develop more therapies. And also we have to test and research these therapies, whether they really work in clinical trials. At that time, one did not think about real world evidence, but there was a desire to develop alternative and more treatments than what we had on hand at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And while we go in that direction, it's interesting because in your book you take us back about 150 years or so, and you point out that this real world evidence concept is not new. We didn't, even the modern pharma industry didn't create it. And you take us back to this interesting case of a Dr. Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis, who make some very interesting discoveries back in the 1840s in terms of maternal morbidity. Introduce us to the themes. What are we talking about when we talk about real world evidence? And then contrast that, because we were talking about data, of course, which is a part of the real world evidence equation. Talk about the difference there between those two things and sort of a little bit of the background history to where this space really started off.
Yeah, it's nice that you mentioned Ignaz Semmelweis. Not only he was a fellow European, Austrian actually, but I really liked this story. And just spending 90 seconds on explanation, what is it behind this story? There was this kind of puerperal fever, meaning women shortly after giving birth very often developed fever and died. And he just compared two wards, areas or wards where physicians, doctors worked, and other areas where only nurses worked and midwives worked. And he found out that the mortality rate in the area where physicians worked was very high, was higher than the area where only nurses worked. So this is also interesting to mention because today, in the time of fake news and misinformation, one would immediately say it's the physician's fault. They kill people. But what actually was behind that, the physician also performed autopsies. Right. And there was no knowledge about bacteria, and there was no kind of celebration with hand washing and hygiene or so. So they performed autopsies on women who died from this infection and then went to the ward and treated other women, and therefore they transferred the bacteria. At that time, they did not know about the existence of bacteria, but they knew there is something which they transport or contaminate from the autopsies into the ward where the mothers are. So it has a lot of aspects which we have to consider today also when we perform real world evidence research. It has to come from the real world, meaning not from an experimental protocol, from an artificial situation. Controlled clinical trials are still the gold standard in research, and also the gold standards based on which the FDA and other regulatory authorities approve treatments when they have proven in controlled clinical trials that they are safe, that they are tolerable, and that they are effective and really do what they are supposed to do. However, clinical trials, despite they are scientifically extremely sophisticated, they are experimental situations. So no patient in real life gets the same treatment and the same attention as a clinical trial patient gets in a clinical study. So real world results may look quite different, and therefore real world studies have to complement what we find in clinical trials. And if both point into the same direction, then we have the proof, we have the rigorous scientific proof, and we have the real world proof that this is actually also implementable in the daily medical practice. And there are many examples about that. There are studies about that, studies, publications where, for example, treatments for hematologic diseases are examined which have been approved by the FDA based on early clinical trials, and then later the same treatment has been tested in real world studies. And for real world studies, usually you take electronic medical records, you take records which come just from the day-to-day medical practice, and you analyze them properly. We can talk later what would be a proper analysis and what kind of pitfalls you have to consider in order not to make an error. But these publications show that relatively often the real world benefit is not as much as the benefit which was seen in the randomized clinical trials. So you need both. I can give you another example in the daily world, which is not medical, but perhaps is really easy to understand by everybody. If we have this 1 minute, because I like to tell it, it's a little bit closer to my heart as a originally German-born person. German is a car country and has Volkswagen, and perhaps many people have heard about it, the so-called Volkswagen diesel scandal. But you do not have to know about the Volkswagen diesel scandal, but you know that your car's fuel consumption is usually different from what you see in the window sticker. Because in the window sticker, these are experiments, these are results from experimental situations. The car stands in a laboratory on wheels, on rolls, so the wheels are turning, the engine is running, but the car is not driving on streets. But even if they test it on streets, they have strict protocols about speed, acceleration, and all this kind of stuff. And that's how they come up with the fuel consumption and also with the exhaust values. So in real life, you know that as a car driver, you drive sometimes faster, sometimes slower. It depends on the traffic, it depends on the weather. Sometimes you have wind, sometimes you have rain, sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's warm. So the real world situation is totally different. What makes the whole thing a scandal is that Volkswagen was smart enough and had a software and says, oh, the car notices when the car is in an experimental situation because the wheels are turning, but the car is not moving.
Yeah.
And then the software activated a specific program which had the engine running very fuel efficient and very clean. So the results of the experimental situation were intentionally manipulated into a clean and fuel efficient way, something which never happens in real life. And since this was intentionally, Volkswagen had a little bit trouble legally.
Yeah.
Why I'm mentioning is that in clinical trials, something similar happens. For ethical reasons and legal reasons, patients need to be informed. They need to sign many papers of informed consent that they are in a clinical trial. So like the Volkswagen car, the patients in the clinical trials, they know that they are in an experimental situation. And depending on what you measure in a clinical trial, the more subjective the outcome is, the more you have an effect which is called sometimes placebo effect, sometimes Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is that people behave differently when they know that they are observed.
Oh, yeah.
So this is another reason why clinical trials, yes, highly scientific, gold standard, very well as a proof of theoretical efficacy and safety. But in order to know whether this works in daily medical practice, you need real world evidence studies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you know, along those lines, Manfred, you point out in the book that okay, we have this holy grail model, but hey, the last 25 years or so, the world has changed a lot. Smartphones, EHR, social media, obviously the internet. But before it's interesting because I took a look at sort of that 1990 to 2015 period when you're in pharma and you know you're doing I guess sort of these are sort of the pre real world evidence type of work, but nonetheless they were kind of interesting. You know, at Merck you were studying you know sort of angiotensin two inhibitor switches from ACE inhibitors. You were doing this interesting phase 4 work on beta blockers and ACE inhibitors at Forest. What were things like in the sort of the before the world changed, you're trying to make this stuff happen. There aren't a lot of EHR at the time. There's no AI. You know, this concept of pharmacogenomics is out there, but it hasn't really happened yet. What were sort of the early days like for you at at Merck at Forest, where they're like, I want to do this real world evidence stuff? Was it easy? Did you get a lot of hesitancy pushed your way? What were things like before the world changed? Let's say.
So let me just comment. You really read everything. You read the whole book. I mean, this is unbelievable. So thank you very much. It's only 250 pages. So yes, this was in the 90s, and the 90s were the time when GCP was introduced, good clinical practice, the worldwide global standard of doing clinical trials. On the one hand, it's really amazing that the pharmaceutical and the regulatory world worldwide, mainly dominated by US, Europe, and Japan, could agree on one standard how to do clinical trials for drug development. That's amazing. If you just think if you travel from Europe to the United States or from the United States to Europe, you need a different plug for your electrics. So they couldn't even agree on one standard for an electric plug, not even talking about the voltage, 220 volt versus 110 volts, and many, many other things. If you look at the iPhone and the Lightning cable versus the USB-A, USB-C cable and other cables, there is no industry standard for some simple things like cables and voltage. But the drug development and drug regulatory approval industry and the regulatory agencies, they were able across US, Europe, and Japan, and then other countries obviously followed, to develop a worldwide standard on how to do clinical trials, how to define the patient population, how to write a study protocol, how to analyze these data. It was mainly driven by the so-called International Conference of Harmonization, ICH. So ICH GCP is the standard even today in several updates and versions, but it is still relatively similar like it was 25, 30 years ago. And this was in the 90s when I worked in the pharmaceutical industry when this standard was introduced. Also at that time, of course, we were all under competition. So the faster you can enroll clinical trials, the better, because every delay would mean for the later drug a loss of theoretical benefit and profit. Of course, on the one side, you can always say pharmaceutical industry is it's profit oriented. So it's profit oriented. On the other hand, it's also a benefit for patients who are waiting for therapies if drugs come earlier in the market. But you cannot really push too hard because you do not want to make mistakes. It's about the safety. You really have to make sure that the drugs are very well tolerated and do not have side effects, which may be very serious. So we developed many kind of ways how to randomize and fill these studies fast as possible, and how to treat these patients from a logistic point of view as comfortable as possible. Uh, these days, for example, companies sometimes organize Uber drivers to bring them to their visits with free transportation, which sometimes obviously prevents people from participating in clinical trials if the location where they have to go to perhaps every week or every second week is a little bit difficult to reach with public transportation. So they have several methods. Uber drivers, little kind of gold cards which give them preferable appointments and less waiting time. All these things are activities which increase the Hawthorne effect, which increase the difference between clinical trial logistics versus real world daily medical practice logistics. But at that time, obviously, we developed tricks like that to make the study patients feel as comfortable and as well taken care of as possible, which leads to the conclusion that almost nobody is treated as well in real life as they are treated in a clinical trial.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's because you were talking about before, and I think it'd be interesting to get, you mentioned obviously the different learnings, actually the pitfalls in setting up proper real world evidence research, how you might find that the benefit of something is better or not when we do these types of studies. And as mentioned again in your bio, you helped build the largest real world evidence research network when you were at TriNetX. And again here, and you can go in any direction you want with this, but obviously the type of studies that you were doing here, everything from analyzing the relative effectiveness of various antihypertensive treatments, looking at SGLT2 inhibitors and cardiovascular protection. One that's very near and dear to me, this huge prostate cancer prevention trial. Obviously looking at the finasteride and prostate cancer development. Again, talk about how these different programs sort of fell into your portfolio at that company. And again, some of the learnings when you're dealing with these, I mean, in the case of the prostate cancer prevention trial, you're looking at, 20,000 men, 7 years. I mean, things that we wouldn't normally see, as you were mentioning, in the traditional clinical studies, but, walk us through a little of this. They're all equally fascinating.
Yeah, so clinical trials, depending obviously what you measure, have usually about, let's say, 200, 500 to, let's say, 5,000 or if they're really, really large clinical trials, 10,000 patients, and they cost many, many millions of dollars and can take, depending on what you measure, months to many, many years. So there's a big, big, big effort. Real world evidence studies take available electronic medical records. It's extremely important to mention that normally there is no danger for patient privacy because in contrast to the regular consumer business where Google or other companies, they are interested in your individual shopping behavior because they want to target specific advertising to your specific interests. In real world evidence medical research, we are not interested in individual people. We are interested in populations.
Yeah.
The population of diabetics, the populations of hypertensive patients. And therefore, the data can be anonymized and the data can be accumulated. There are no results of individual patients. So if at all, then the accumulation is of about groups of at least 10 or better 100 patients, where in this group it will hardly possible to identify one individual. So this is very important to mention. The data can come from electronic medical records, from medical practices, from hospitals, can also go from wearables, from my watch or from other things, everything what is not in an experimental in a study situation. And what we did with TriNetX, the first really global, big real-world evidence and electronic medical records network, had these relationships with healthcare providers worldwide, hospitals worldwide, and was able to create a network of about, they may now be in the area of 300 or 400 millions of patients. So these are huge numbers, a huge experience. In the times before real-world evidence, if you wanted to evaluate the treatment or the experience and you were talking with your doctor, what do you think? Should I take this medicine? Can I combine it with another medicine? What would be the side effects? Then the doctor had experience from his medical training or from literature, from individual publications, or we also had the opportunity to ask one other doctor a second opinion. Or we can ask someone in the family. So you perhaps got information or feedback from 3, 5, 6, maximum 10 medical professionals who had experience in the same disease, depending on the disease, perhaps with a total of 100 patients. With real-world evidence, you get experience from thousands of physicians who have experience in treating patients with this specific situation, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of patients.
Right.
So this is a huge amount of experience coming from the real medical practice. This is extremely important. And therefore, one can do a lot of studies where it would be too expensive, too costly, and would take too long to do it as a prospective randomized clinical trials. And that's where things like, for example, you mentioned questions come into play. Finasteride, which is used against benign prostate hypertrophy and also against hair loss. And there were, of course, some questions. How safe is it if you take it for over a long time, over many, many, many years? And you can evaluate that by looking at tens of thousands of patients who took it and how they did over 5 or 10 years. And was there indeed an increased rate of prostate cancer? And we could find no, there was not an increased rate of prostate cancer. There was not even an increased rate of sexual dysfunction, which is listed as a side effect,
Right.
but it was not confirmed in our real world study. Or If you go to the GLP-1 agonists, which are a huge topic these days, originally developed to lose weight, then one found out they are good against diabetes, then one found out, oh, they are good against liver disease, then one found out, oh, they are good against cardiovascular problems. Now, there is even a discussion whether they may be good against dementia or Alzheimer's. For such results, you need long-term studies. And it seems to be, it goes indeed into that direction, but it has not been proven everywhere. But what real-world data tell us is that many patients do not take these SGL1, GPT-1, no,
GLP-1.
GLT1 agonists, too many abbreviations in medicine, I can
That's
tell you.
okay.
As long as it would need it to experience all these potential benefits. 50% of the patients roughly stop taking these medications after about 6 months when their primary intention, meaning weight loss, is achieved. So these other benefits, liver diabetes, cardiac healthy, or not even talking about dementia and Alzheimer's, would require taking that much, much longer. And then it comes also into play whether this is cost efficient. Then suddenly it's not only the individual patient, but we also have to look at the perspective of the healthcare system. So these are potential future applications of this methodology.
Yeah, that's very interesting in the sense, I last year I had a gentleman, Dr. Nadim Sawar from Novo, on the show, and he runs this transformational prevention group there. And as you were mentioning, beyond diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular, and dementia, of course, they got a long list. I mean, they have over 200 indications that they're thinking about. And so again, it fits very nicely into ultimately how we explore sort of that extra dimension of what, because we're in this era of repurposing as well, where we have drug X for disease Y, but we don't know what it does for anything else. And I see a lot of really interesting applications there looking out.
And this is actually one area where the regulatory agencies and the FDA specifically are very interested in real-world data, not only for long-term safety observation, but also for finding new indications for drugs which are already on the market in one specific indications, but are often given, we call it off-label.
Right.
But depends on how much off-label it is. Sometimes it's just on the edge of the original indication. And then you can, with real world data, prove that another indication or another reason to give the drug may make a lot of sense. And this happened actually. So the regulatory authorities are really open to real world data when they are collected in quality and analyzed in good quality, because then they can approve new indications based on a real world data. It happens with tacrolimus, for example. It happens with aortic valves, for example. It's of course not possible to develop a completely new drug with real world data because it's not on the market yet. So we always will need clinical trials, randomized and controlled clinical trials. But from a regulatory point of view, safety monitoring and new indications are very, very good ways to use real world data.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And before you were talking about wearables and some of the interesting new ways to collect this real world data. Take us like sort of a little bit over the horizon, and where you think, what technologies excite you. We've talked a lot about things like in silico studies and digital twins and some of this other stuff that's coming down the pike. I know, based on your ultrasound experience, these things are capable of doing all sorts of stuff for us. what is the real world evidence, real world data gathering landscape look like in your opinion if we go out 10 years, 15 years? What do you expect
Yeah,
is going
yeah.
to be the model here for this very important system?
So currently, the biggest business application of real-world evidence is by data like my former company, TriNetX, but many other companies who have this, is collaboration with the pharmaceutical industry for
Yeah,
improving clinical trials, enrollment speed, market research, and this kind of things.
right.
But there are much, much more opportunities to do. So in case that someone from Google, from Oracle, from Yahoo, from Apple listens to this podcast, people do the following. First, you have to find a way that physicians, when they sit together with the patients, do not turn around and look in the monitor, and instead of talking with the patients, they put something into the computer. So there is natural language processing, so it has to be a way where an artificial intelligence or an NLP application can watch, like a nurse, when the nurse is sitting there, watch the interaction between doctor and patients and transfers this automatically into the electronic medical records.
Mm,
Currently, the major hurdle in other countries who have not yet introduced EMR, electronic medical records, so completely like the United States. I'm specifically watching in Germany, of course. Uh, the burden for the physicians to fill this stuff into databases is so big that there is a lot of resistance. And this is unfortunately then a huge loss of opportunities for research. So it has to be automated. The next is what I want to tell all these business people is make it available not only for the pharmaceutical companies, but also develop a B2C, meaning a business to customer model, where, like Google, the user can just Google search and said, I want to know how many different drugs I have to take when I have diabetes and hypertension and renal failure, or what the side effects would be, etc. So the same way how you can now Google for literature, for information, for comments as a normal patient, as a regular patient, as a user, as a consumer, the same way a consumer needs to be possible to also include real world data of millions of patients into their search. And there are applications, browser-based applications available, but these real-world data companies share that only with the pharmaceutical companies. Understandable, because that's the biggest market. These are subscription models. That's where you can make a lot of money. But Google has found a business model directly to the consumer, and this is the next step which has to happen. Another thing is be careful with artificial intelligence. Everything what the artificial intelligence can spit out as an answer is only as good as the data which they rely on to create this answer. So if the information which an AI system, a ChatGPT has, if the information is biased in one or the other direction, then the output is also biased. So we as user have to be careful when we use ChatGPT, and I use it a lot for research, for brainstorming,
right.
for getting information. But it is always the human brain which has to sit on top and has to evaluate whether is this answer really correct? Can it be correct? I compare it with you have a very, very smart, intelligent friend, and you are watching, you're sitting and have a small talk with them during a cocktail party, and he has perhaps already two or three drinks. Then you do not always take everything deadly serious what this person says. But the person may be very, very knowledgeable and very, very smart, so very, very helpful in a small talk, in a conversation. But don't copy and paste it into your case. Always make a red face test, a quality test. Uh, but otherwise, artificial intelligence in this field is obviously a huge help, especially when it comes to identifying risk patients, seeing patterns in symptoms in laboratory values, something where perhaps a human brain, even a smart doctor, does not necessarily identify, oh, there's something going on.
Right.
AI may be much, much better. And actually, a team of both Israel Hospital and MIT have developed an algorithm who can identify risk patients with early stage of pancreatic cancer before they even get by conventional diagnosis their first symptoms and their first diagnosis. So this is certainly something where AI can help us a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been seeing. Obviously, that's one excellent sort of real world case or a set of cases in terms of AI. We've seen a lot on the AI sort of assisted drug development front in the last several years. I guess it still remains to be seen whether AI will do as good a job in picking interesting novel drug candidates as sort of the old school approach, and that remains to be seen. But we'll know in, I guess, a few years when some of those products start making their way into later stage clinical development. Let's talk a little bit about this other very important set of themes that you've brought up today, and also, obviously in the book, in terms of this, of the democratization of this data and information. Obviously you talked about the chat GPT, and you make the point in the book that, look, just like the transformation that happened with the clinical trials system, major transformation in just how people all over this world are accessing medical information, the speed by which they're accessing it. And then ultimately, you point out, like, patients know more about their disease than physicians before they even get into the doctor's office. That's great. But at the same time, we have this really odd phenomena that's happening. I don't know so much how did you see it in Germany, but a lot here, of sort of this jettisoning of sort of the respect of the existing expert in lieu of the digitized AI version of stuff. And I just love you to take us down. I know you sort of categorize sort of this data, everything from rumors to proof and everything in between. Walk us down this kind of delicate tightrope where they were on in 2025, because I see all the potential, but at the same time, a lot of potential for patients going in the wrong direction. And I'd love you to take that in some different directions.
Yeah, with all this excitement about the real world evidence, of course, one has to pay attention and one has to see also the risks, because every new development has also their risks and has their safety precautions, and one has to know how to use them. It's obvious. Just think, you have access to a lot of data, you can draw the wrong conclusions.
Right.
Just today, I found a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, and if you read only the headline, or if you just look at the first two sentences, you see that in Europe and in the United States, wealth and mortality is inversely correlated. So the richer you are, the longer you live. The poorer you are, the shorter you live. So it is important to say, this is just a correlation. Correlation is
Right.
not causality. And this is one of the most important potential pitfalls you can stumble over, and of course could be misunderstood or misinterpreted or intentionally miscommunicated, depending on which political side you are. And of course, you also have to be careful not to take action only on incidental correlation. Would it really make sense to give the poor people money so they can live longer? Would the dollar figures indeed extend their lives? So if you do not know what the causality is between these two data, you do not know what would be the intervention. It could be indeed that poorer people cannot really afford a good health care and therefore they have a lower life expectancy. But it could also be the case because they are pure, because they are uh, because they have a less because they have lower health, let's phrase it this way, because they have lower health, they have some risks, they have some diseases, they cannot make so much money. So are they poor because they are sick, or are they sick because they are poor?
Yeah.
So these correlations and causality has to be taken into account. And other things which one has to be careful is really some other more or less statistical things like median and average and risk benefit evaluation. Is it something like if there is a 20% risk reduction, this is sounds relative impressive, but if it's in absolute percentage point, perhaps only between 3 and 2.5%, the absolute is relatively low, and you would perhaps treat a large group of patients unnecessarily who would never experience the benefit because the disease or the event is so rare to begin with. This is something where the so-called number needed to treat would help. So this is something where we go a little bit into the specifics of statistics, but it's since the information which we are exposed to becomes more and more overwhelming, more and more complicated, we as consumers of information have to catch up, we have to learn. We cannot rely on the government, and we should not rely on the government, that the government controls information flow, because still we are a country of freedom of speech and freedom of information. So it's on us, on the people, on the citizens, to get so educated and get so knowledgeable that we are able to identify fake news, misinformation, disinformation. The easiest way is to get a little bit stepwise. And the first is there's an information, it may be a rumor, it may be something which you see on X, Twitter, Instagram, TV channel, MSNBC, Fox News, whatever you get. And the first step is really think about it intellectually, intelligently. Does this make sense? Does it pass the red-faced test? Uh, based on what you know so far. And the next is, where does the information come from? The information does not come from MSNBC and Fox. They have their sources. So
Right.
what could be the source? Is it somewhere published? Did someone say it? And then, are there studies? Are there real world studies? Are there scientific proofs? This all takes time, obviously. You cannot immediately, within 30 seconds, if you read something on the internet, immediately say, oh, I like it. Oh, I forward it. I multiply it, because it takes time to validate it and to think about what's really behind that. And that's the risk if you react to internet news, cable news, social media news immediately within seconds. You are in an emotional level, and you are more likely to spread out whatever disinformation, fake news you have seen without checking what's the truth behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something we as educated, knowledgeable citizens have to learn, because this is the basis for democracy. The basis for democracy is that the citizens, the people are smart enough, educated enough, knowledgeable enough to be active and responsible participants in democracy. I think that the danger to democracy does not necessarily come from above. The danger to democracy can come among ourselves if we are not able to validate the information which we are bombarded with.
Mhm.
It was never so easy to get information from the internet, but it was never so difficult to evaluate whether this information is true or not. And that's where we have to invest some more time and some more brain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Very interesting times. Well, I mean, again, your book, Real World Evidence Unveiled, really, it's a refreshing look at all these issues. You also, just a couple months ago, Applied Clinical Trials have a really nice paper on the importance of real world evidence in medical research and drug development. Looking at all aspects of research as well as the regulatory side of things. What else, Manfred, is coming up for you? I mean, you have Candid Advisory. You're obviously advising a variety of pharma groups on further applications of these tools and technologies. But what should we be on the lookout for in terms of 2025 and you in terms of other public-facing initiatives, conferences, talks, anything else on the calendar, and anything else you want to talk about while we have you today? But please.
So for me personally, obviously the focus currently, I stumbled somehow a few years ago into this real world evidence topic coming from the clinical trials world. So now I focus a little bit more on that. I'm advising companies still on clinical trials, still on real world evidence, but in general, the overall headline is always medical research. But it's interesting that this method, of course, is also applicable to other areas, other industries. So the advisory part is now a little bit of a focus, whether it's writing, publishing, presenting, giving presentations, or other ways of distributing the knowledge which I have acquired in the past 30 or almost 40, I hate to say, 40 years of professional experience. And it's, of course, also mixed in with ideas for the future. We have been talking a little bit about AI, about business to customer business models for this kind of business. We cannot predict the future. One has to be open, and one has to be creative. And this is the way how I am currently thinking. You never know exactly what will happen, but when something happens, then you have to be open to it.
Absolutely. No, excellent point. And, well, obviously, again, looping back to the very beginning, you clearly, set the stage for everything you were doing 40 years ago and then putting together just the intellectual capacity and capabilities. And I enjoy everything you're talking about, and I really look forward to seeing how this whole area of the industry continues to evolve, and what the real world evidence landscape is going to look like in 2035, and what clinical trials are going to look like. But it's an exciting time. So I look forward to again seeing you continue to be part of this and advising groups properly on how to do these things. Final messages, Manfred, while we have you today, please.
So I think our viewers are perhaps already quite overwhelmed by all the contents which we have bombarded them with. I specifically thank the viewers for being patient and watching until the very end. This shows that the topic is interesting and that you are interested in it. Uh, I, from my point of view, perhaps would like to leave it like that. I repeat myself, one never knows exactly, one cannot predict the future and knows exactly what comes. But if it comes, you have to be open for it. When you look past, then it's very often that you uh, apply what you experienced in the past and the learning experiences to the future. You never make mistakes in the past. You have learning experiences and can use them for the time ahead of us. This sounds almost a little bit like a cheap life coaching speech, but my experience tells me that's how it is. That's how it is. You relatively often regret that you have not done something in the past. You never regret that you did something in the past. Or if it was not 100% right, then you at least you learn from it. I just would like to leave it like that for now. But perhaps in another episode of your podcast, we can go there a little bit deeper.
We'll definitely do that. Definitely do that. For everybody that is going to be listening across the various podcast networks or watching this episode on our YouTube channel, again, you've been spending time with Dr. Manfred Stapff, founder, Candid Advisory. Pick up a copy of his new book, Real World Evidence Unveiled, Navigating the Maze of Modern Misinformation. Again, Manfred, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us for a little while. Thank you for everything you do in developing this exciting new area of our industry. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for millions of patients out there via what you're doing to help develop these technologies. Really a great story.
Thank you very much, Ira. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much, and it was a pleasurable hour talking to you.
Great having you.